before we read the scriptures, let's look at like what the audience is and what is going on.
I think that's great.
They were dealing with the same thing, commands over culture. They're in Ephesus, which is, it's like the New York City of the Roman Empire. It's the largest religious temple in the Mediterranean. This temple of Artemis was the largest religious temple in the Mediterranean, in the whole Roman Empire. And so it was both a religious capital and it was an economic capital in trade and everything like New York City is to America. It was the largest economic and religious center in the entire empire. The Temple of Artemis is the same as Isis and Diana and Ishtar. She was the same goddess of the hunt and the goddess of that protected nature, but it was a woman in control. It was a woman, it was the worship of the feminine identity, just as Isis or Ishtar was. So this is what they're dealing with in this city. It is the pagan Mecca of the Roman Empire, you know, and they had sacrifices there. That's why they were dealing with what do we eat? Should we only be vegetarians or what are, you know, and again, you got to remember is there was a synagogue, I guess, in Ephesus, but they're mainly dealing with Gentile believers coming out of this pagan cult. And it literally was a cult where, you had to come, like a convert, and there was rituals and rites that they kept secret that only people that were in knew how to do it. It was one of those, it was it was in every way a cult, you know, that had secrecies, you know, on how they operate. And so much so that Ephesus took pride in this temple. It was their identity. And, you know, like as much as Jerusalem temple would have been to the Jews. And it's interesting when you look at different statues of Artemis. In some ways, she's a gorgeous woman huntress. But in Ephesus in particular, they found statues of her where she's wearing garments that are like burdened. It could be bosoms, or it could be, there's a debate. It could have been 3 different things representing. One of them could be the feminine bosom, you know, like multiples, anywhere from 18 to 25 of them. And it looked like it's a garment that she wore, and some priests wore that too. Others believe it could have been bull testicles.
Wow.
That were hanging, because all of those things represent fertility.
Fertility.
Right? And they're like, well, we didn't find...
Fertility goddess.
They didn't find a lot of cow carcasses in their sacrifices there, but it's like, well, if you're castrating cows, doesn't mean they're necessarily killing the cows, you know?
Right.
So it could have been scrotums, basically.
Yeah.
Or it could have been what they found archaeologically, that there was these amber vessels that they would make offerings into, and sometimes they would have strings in them, so you could wear these, or they would set them on her, or they would set them on her statue,
right?
You know, and
didn't that symbolize plenty?
Yeah, it's about plenty. So what
potentially hanging testicles around her.
She was both, right? She was both, and that's what Ishtar did too. She wasn't just male; she was female. I mean, wasn't just female; she was male. She tried to blend the genders, and that's what's going on with at the Temple of Artemis. And what they found too is those statues of her was particular to Ephesus. There was other statues of her, like her brother was Apollo. He had a temple there too. But she represented, it was in every way like Ishtar of the Old Testament. And but what made it really unique too, and Ishtar did the same thing too in Babylon, that they took their religious thing and it was woven into their economic structure too. So they found these statues, even though they had some there in the temple, those statues of abundance that shared fertility and abundance basically represented, those were in their civil buildings outside of the temple. So they had brought her worship even as a part of the civil society. You know, it totally encompassed the entire culture you know? And that's what I believe Timothy's dealing with, is these people that are coming out of this. So when we see some of these problems, even here in the first chapter, those things are those are like abominations they're bringing with them into the Christian church, and they're wanting to be teachers of the law, and they have no understanding, so they're bringing the very things our Deuteronomy reading here, like don't do what they're doing. Timothy's dealing with these new believers that we have to, and they have to set the women straight, about who's the leaders, and they were neglecting their widows, and some women were flaunting their wealth, because that's a part of Ephesus.
I was going to say that's
part of so we're dealing with the Ephesus, the Ephesian, the people, and Paul is mentoring Timothy on how to how to do this. And Timothy's background, from what I understand, as a very young man, had a passion, just like we were dealing with the passion of the Levites who want to serve in the temple. He had a passion. He witnessed Paul at one time, and it made him passionate for the Torah. And Timothy devoted his young manhood to studying the law. So he was qualified. Paul was basically, knowing where Paul was at, he was basically handing the torch off to his mentor,
Yep.
and giving him advice on how to straighten this church out in Ephesus, because of his wisdom. He's mentoring Timothy on how to deal with this. And I think it's really interesting, something in our study today. I was curious about the church of Ephesus, and in Revelation 2, if you read Revelation 2 about the angel of the church of Ephesus, and how John is writing to the church of Ephesus, right, in his vision in Revelation, you can understanding what they're dealing with there. Then when you read Revelation 2, John is addressing the same issues and praising them because they drove out the false prophets and the Nicolaitans, and so it shows you that Timothy did his job. By the time John writes about them, because John would have written Revelation much later. You know what I mean? But I think it gives you insight into what John writes in Revelation 2 about Ephesus as well. And I think in the areas where he praises them, to me it shows that Timothy did his job.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so let's have context, I think it's real interesting. You can I did a little bit this morning, but you can spend some time on YouTube studying Artemis and the Temple of Art. It's one of the 8 wonders of the world.
Well, it's interesting too, because the more you talk about it, the more I think about the feminism in our culture, and thinking about putting the testicles on the statue. I'm like, well, we have some sayings around that kind of stuff. In our modern culture,
right?
Because it's cultural, that some men will give up those things to.
So what we're dealing with is the
feminism.
over culture in one of the most pagan cultures, the Ephesus of pagan cultures of the Roman Empire at the time.
Makes sense.
And I believe most of the fellowship would have been Gentiles coming in.
Makes sense.
And I think it's also interesting that the temple system there was very much tied to their economic system, and it's very similar, I think, to what we see church today. Yeah. There's so much money involved. It's a profession. What I mean? And it's ministries building empires. Yeah.
Yeah. And in some cases, building it to leave for the next generation and the next generation, and so on. And it's or a corporation where they have 20 locations or 30 locations. And, it's a different way. The real question is where, in some cases, where does this directly go against the commandments if it does? Or how does this potentially lead people into not keeping the commandments, or lead people into this, because the structure is so worldly that it just then is more people are more easily led into sin. And I think there's probably a lot of those kinds of things happening because we know that there are some churches out there that are doing great stuff. But it's also interesting, like the parallels around our culture now are so obvious. It's like we sit here, we look at the Torah, and we say, like, this is obviously like idols, right? This is obviously going against the commandments. And we think, like, a lot of Christians read that and think, like, yeah, we don't have idols, and we don't do these kinds of things. But they don't realize, just like the Gentiles coming out of those pagan practices, they had to be told how this was going against God. And we see in a lot of churches where it's like people will try to sometimes tell these people like how this is going against God, and they're like, they can't see it. They can't see it at all. And one of the reasons they can't see it is because if you don't have the commandments to line up against, then how do you tell people that they're going wrong? You know, and so it might seem like, why are they having to tell these people this in this culture? Like, isn't this kind of simple? Wouldn't they have known this? Like, but until you understand the context, like, this is not like modern America to some extent, but then also, yeah, it is like modern America. We just don't know, just like they didn't know anymore. Also, when he talks about by rejecting these, some have suffered shipwreck regarding their faith. Among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I handed over to Satan to be disciplined. That was interesting.
Yeah, it seems like in the first part of this chapter, he doesn't want to name the people he's talking about. He keeps saying certain people. And then at the end, including these two clowns.
Including these two clowns.
And again, and he left him there in Ephesus that he may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine. So he set him there, left them, Timothy, there to keep the church, keep the fellowship on track.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we know, even in this first century, that a lot of wolves are starting to come in. Mm. And that's what I'm saying is like, these people that are coming in have this other pagan doctrine with their ideas of what fellowship is supposed to look like.
When I imagine like the responsibility set before Timothy and these other guys would have been, one, to know Torah as much as they could, right? So Paul would have been the perfect person to teach them that, right? So it's like teaching them that. But then when he set them in charge in that sense, he would have been like, all right, you're the filter, you're the guard, you're the whatever you want to call it. Like, everything that doesn't align with this, get rid of it. Like, just like, don't let it even come near. And again, it's just the nature of guarding something means you have to know what's, just like the body's immune system. You have to know what's supposed to come in, what's not supposed to come in, right? And what would they have been using to determine that? It would have been the Torah. But they would have had to be so diligent. So it would have been like, no, you don't bring that in here. You don't do that. Like, if people are really wanting Yeshua and wanting to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they would have been like, okay, we'll leave that outside, or we'll, whatever. And it's just, we're in a very similar situation today, except the churches are letting stuff in, right? Like, and it's just, so we don't see that happening. We don't see an example of that and what that would look like in today's culture, because nobody's really doing it, because they don't have the commandments.
You have an open door policy.
And I imagine, like, there were a lot of new things that were going to have to be worked out, things that they hadn't dealt with before.
Absolutely.
In terms of, well, what about, how are we to understand who Yeshua is?
Yeah.
And his character and who he is, and how are we to understand, like, Gentile and Jew? I mean, they hadn't worked that stuff out yet.
No.
Still haven't worked that out, but
no, we still haven't.
So I imagine having someone like Timothy who knew the word so well. He knew that him being with Paul and going through all this, like, I don't know what the time span is, but you imagine the challenges that would come up that he's having to deal with in terms of just answering questions. Even people who were trying to do right trying to do the right thing.
Well, look at us now. We're saying the same kinds of things. We're saying that when some people ask questions, we're like,
Sure about that.
I'm not really sure. And we're in a unique situation. This is new.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, is it new? But it's new to us.
Right.
It's new to us. Like we weren't raised in Torah.
Right.
We weren't raised in a Hebrew home. So we're still having to learn so much stuff. And even for those of us who have been doing this for a longer time, it's like there's still circumstances and situations that are going to come up and questions that we're having to figure out in the context of the world we live in right now. This is kind of the state we're in until Yeshua comes back.
So to not teach any different doctrine, and to not devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies which promote speculations, like going off on, rather than the stewardship from God that is by faith. So how would you be a good steward? Mm-hmm. By keeping his commandments. It's like the stewardship,
Yeah, the guarding of.
In so many churches, and this is especially bad in the Hebrew roots movement, they find some new idea and they latch onto it, and this becomes their entire identity. It's one thing. Mm-hmm. And there's so much more in the Bible. There's so much more stuff we can be talking about.
Yeah, I think we've seen a lot of that. We've seen a lot of it where it's like, it's some new thing. It's something that is a shiny object. It looks interesting, but it is not really relevant to the essentials. And I think that is one of the things Paul's saying is like, if we don't focus on the foundations and the essentials,
mm-hmm.
We're going to get lost. And so he's pointing back to Torah. And he's never saying there's nothing else. He's not saying there's nothing else to consider,
mm-hmm.
the basics. He's just saying let's get these people focused on this. And obviously for newbies who are immersed in a pagan culture, that's all you want to do is drill the same stuff over and over until they get it.
Right.
It's like raising a toddler. You just drill the same stuff over and over until they get it.
And when someone who is raised in that, especially someone who is educated and indoctrinated into it, mm-hmm. You can't ever stop doing that. For the rest of their lives, you have to keep reiterating the basics because the stuff that they learned before is imprinted in their brains. It will always creep up again. And I find this happening to me a lot. That I have to keep reminding myself of the things that are actually in Scripture, because things that I learned decades ago will reimpose themselves if I don't keep reminding myself.
Yeah.
And one of the lessons that we've learned is the deeper into the system you are, whatever it is, whether it's some pagan thing or Jehovah's Witnesses or the modern Christian church, the deeper and more dedicated you are to that, the longer you need to wait before moving into ministry on the other side.
And Paul set the example for that.
Right. And I think that's what we've experienced personally, mm-hmm. that they all want to be teachers and they don't yet have the understanding. And I think we also saw it in Acts, I forgot it was, when they were showing the apostles were having miracles and some of these other,
mm-hmm.
we were like, hey man, how much can we pay you to learn these tricks so we can build our stuff around this too? So to them, it's like a new niche. It's a new genre. We need to add, we see that in churches all the day.
Oh, yeah.
We need to add these new ministries.
They go learn from each other about their programs. Yeah.
So you want to be a part of a new movement, and because you are qualified to be a pagan leader doesn't necessarily mean you're qualified to be the teacher of Torah.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
You're new to this, but yet because you don't understand and because you're starting to teach a different doctrine, you're creating division in the fellowship. Instead of just being a humble person like Moses was, and you need to learn before you can teach. And we know that there's consequences of being a false teacher. And that's what he says,
But isn't it also a calling from God to be a teacher? It's not something that...
Well, so imagine Paul. He had his calling, right? But he went back in the wilderness for 3.5 years and restudied the Torah to understand it from this new perspective, this new enlightenment that Christ gave him on the road. He didn't go, I'm all of a sudden a teacher. I mean, he spent another 3.5 years just getting it straight in his mind.
Yeah, and this is after a personal visit from Yeshua himself.
Right.
I mean, I don't know anybody who's had that. I know some people who claim to have that. I don't believe them.
Right.
Well, but he also tells us what his personal visit with Yeshua was like. And it wasn't a neo download of everything about Torah reinterpreted in light of the Messiah.
And it wasn't a conversion.
Yeah, and it wasn't a conversion.
Religion.
So what we see about his experience when he meets Yeshua on the road and is, kicked off his horse, this is not him relearning everything over and over again and everything all of a sudden being remapped in his brain. And I think we read stories like this oftentimes from a modern perspective, and it's like, oh yeah, it was a conversion to a new way. It was like all this stuff. And even thinking about it, it's like, I don't believe that this was a conversion of Paul that he had, right? But I do believe that he met Yeshua, right? But that baggage of him converting is a lifetime of baggage for me. So when I read the story, if I don't read it with new eyes, I will forget that all that happened was he met Yeshua and was called to his purpose.
Right.
That's it.
And it's like a light bulb.
This was not a download of all the information like Neo got in the Matrix.
Yeah. And the most important part of Paul's conversion, if you want to call it that, is when he humbled himself and went to the uneducated leader of this rabble that he had been persecuting and teach me. Like he spent some time by himself, went off into the wilderness, and then he went to James. I'm getting the order mixed up, I think. He went to James, and James was not Paul was one of the most educated people in Judea. James was one of the most uneducated. And from his letter and what we know about him, apparently self-taught. He learned the scriptures very well and learned all kinds of other stuff. But he didn't learn it by going to school. He didn't have a mentor rabbi like Paul did. I mean, he had a rabbi that he didn't even believe in until after he died.
That's funny. That's true. That's really interesting.
But Paul humbled himself and went and learned from this fisherman or carpenter, probably, whatever James was. That more than anything else shows Paul's change in character. That was his real conversion, I think, from being the proud scholar and enforcer for the Sanhedrin to being willing to subject himself to this hick from Galilee.